The final capsule is what I would title Representation and Political Institutions. Women's role in political participation has been extremely significant, has actually increased over a period of time. In this capsule, there are two things that I would want to talk about. One is women's representation through the 73rd Amendment in the panchayat, and also women's representation in the parliament. How have the two panned out over the years? With respect to the former, I would actually like to go back to the Towards Equality report. In the Towards Equality report, there was a section titled The Question of Reservation of Seats for Women in Legislative Bodies. That section had ended with the following recommendation. I quote, "We recommend that the principle of reservation of seats needs to be adopted by all states as a transitional measure. We also recommend the constitution of permanent committees in municipalities to initiate and supervise programs for women's welfare and development." It continues to say that we recommend that political parties should adopt a definite policy regarding the percentage of women candidates to be sponsored by them for elections to parliament and state assemblies. While that may initially start with 15%, this should be gradually increased so that in time to come, the representation of women in legislative bodies has some relationship to their position in the total population of the country or the state. And finally, the Towards Equality report recommended the inclusion of women in all important committees, commissions, all delegations that are appointed to examine socio-economic problems. It is important to remember that 3 members of the committee had a dissenting opinion to this recommendation. However, what is important for us to understand is that when we began the first capsule, we had 15 women members in the Constituent Assembly. And even among those 15 women members, the one voice that was actually common is not to have special treatment through reservation for women. In 1974, in the Towards Equality report, there is a recommendation of reservation of seats, primarily because something like that was already practiced in political bodies, in municipalities, in different states, and they were only trying to institutionalize it through its recommendation. However, saying that this is a transitional measure in order to ensure welfare and development, but also talk about political parties and how political parties should have a certain percentage represented by women. So reservation was an important tool towards representation. And that is something which is important for us to take into cognizance. When the 73rd Amendment to the Constitution was proposed in 1992, in its statement of objectives, it said, and I quote, "Though the Panchayati Raj institutions have been in existence for a long time, it has been observed that these institutions have not been able to acquire the status and dignity of viable and responsive people's bodies due to a number of reasons, including absence of regular elections, prolonged supersession, insufficient representation of weaker sections like scheduled caste, scheduled tribes, and women, inadequate devolution of powers, and lack of financial resources." It is keeping that in mind that 1/3 seats have been reserved through the 73rd Amendment of the Indian Constitution for women. Now, at the level of the panchayat, What we see over the years that women's participation in the panchayats has slowly and surely made an impact on grassroots governance. And that is something which needs to be emphasized and acknowledged. The impact is perhaps the most significant aspect of the entry of women into provincial politics is that many social myths have been shattered. And one of those myths are that these women at the grassroots governance would be forced to serve only as dummies for their husbands. They felt that one way or other, women would be unable to exercise powers as administrators, either because of their own ignorance or other limitations imposed on her by domestic duties. And this was a kind of a general impression that was felt for even states like West Bengal and Kerala, where politicization and democratization of politics had actually happened to the grassroots level, where the impression was that women would be rubber stamps. However, according to Chandan Datta of the Delhi-based non-governmental organization PRIA, Participatory Research in Asia, by and large, women sarpanchas or members attend panchayat or block level meetings by themselves and are not represented by their male relatives. He adds that there has been a perceptible improvement in administration at the Gram Panchayat level because women sarpanchas hold meetings during the day and no dubious deals are struck late at night. They are also more accessible than men who are often not around. And due to some of these factors, there's much more honesty and transparency in local administrative matters. Couple of examples to give from a study that Down to Earth conducted was in villages across India about the ways women are functioning have been quite encouraging. These examples come from Kantipar village in West Bengal's Midnapur district, where Uma Maiti stood up against corruption in allocation of funds under the Indira Abasan program. A handicapped person, Ratna Rai Chaudhary of the same village, fought for and obtained funds under the same scheme. And women make substantial contributions in giving suggestions for raising educational standards, addressing water sanitation and fuel problems. A woman panchayat member from Yavatal district of Maharashtra, as per this down-to-earth study, organized a camp for women to discuss issues like dowry and also convinced women to implement improved stove and biogas systems. So over a period of time, clearly we see grassroots governance and women's participation in this has not only increased, but it has substantively improved in terms of decision making, in terms of participatory governance, in terms of accessibility. If we turn to, on the other hand, if we have to look at women's presence, representation in the parliament, then as per the data that exists from the Election Commission of India, if there are three phases through which we could divide elections, the first phase being 1952 to 1977, the percentage of women MPs in the Lok Sabha was 5%. Between 1977 to 2002, the percentage was 7%. And between 2002 onwards, that percentage has increased to 10%. While women voter turnouts have increased by leaps and bounds in the recent years, and in the very recent Bihar Assembly elections also we saw that. However, representation in lawmaking bodies, both at the state level and in the Lok Sabha, can only be described as abysmally low. Despite the emergence of women voters as agents of change with the potential to swing elections, the representation of women in the lower house of the parliament, the Lok Sabha, as well as the state assemblies, has remained extremely low, to the extent that the data collected by the Inter-Parliamentary Union proves that India is not only faring poorly in terms of women's representation and in comparison to other countries, but more importantly, its position has actually worsened in the last few years. In January 1998, India ranked 95th in terms of women's representation. In 2008, it ranked 144th, while in January 2021, it ranks 148th as per the Inter-Parliamentary Union. By comparison, India's neighbors, China at 86, Pakistan at 116, Bangladesh at 111, and Afghanistan at 71, rank far better than India as per the 2021 report. So a question that needs to be asked is India's dismal women's representation record a consequence of political parties being reluctant to give tickets to women candidates? Or is the representation or a lack of it linked to the oft-cited theory of women being weak candidates despite being nominated to contest polls, women fail to win? We clearly understand that the political space, the institutional political space, is a gendered space. And that is one of the main reasons why we do not see over the years political parties fielding women candidates substantively and women not finding their place rightfully in either Lok Sabha or the Rajya Sabha. And that clearly suggests a lack of representation of women in decision making. And the reason why political representation and having people, citizens from different communities and genders represented politically in democratic decision making is that we will hear multiple voices and voices from the margins. That is one of the main reasons why we require more women in the parliament, more women in grassroots governance.